Erythropoietin is a hormone that is released from cells in kidneys, and it impacts the process of erythropoiesis. Recall, erythropoiesis refers to the production of red blood cells, which starts in the red bone marrow. And I go through some major steps of erythropoiesis in the video named Erythropoiesis Red Blood Cell Production. When kidneys release erythropoietin, since this is a hormone, obviously it travels in bloodstream, and when it gets to the red bone marrow, we see that erythropoietin speed up the reaction that we have here, which would be converting pro-erythroblast into reticulocyte. Recall that throughout this process, at some point, cell loses its nucleus, and as soon as cell loses its nucleus, it turns into reticulocyte. So when erythropoietin speeds up formation of reticulocytes, clearly we end up with formation of erythrocytes much faster. So that would be the impact of erythropoietin in stimulating red bone marrow to produce more red blood cells. Recall that when we talk about the percentage of blood that is occupied by red blood cells, we refer to that as hematocrit. In an average-sized adult, hematocrit is around 45%, which that simply means about 45% of blood is red blood cell. However, when we talk about males versus females, we notice that there is a significant difference in the hematocrit level of male versus female. In adult males, hematocrit level ranges between 40 to 54%, and that would be average 47%. However, in adult females, hematocrit level ranges between 38 to 46%, so that would be average 42%. In both male and female, kidneys release erythropoietin, and erythropoietin speed up converting pro-erythroblast to reticulocyte and results in production of more erythrocyte. But why in male hematocrit level is higher? First of all, let's clarify that male has a larger body mass, more number of cells, and clearly more number of cells indicate that these cells need more oxygen compared to the female body. Also, because we say that male has more number of cells, clearly these cells produce more carbon dioxide. So again, red blood cell count should be higher to remove the carbon dioxide from all these cells. One reason that a female has lower hematocrit level than male is because during the reproductive life of a female, which would be from puberty to menopause, we know that a few days would be the days that from endometrium of the uterus, some layers will shed off and menstruation happens. And as a result, female loses some blood volume. So if you think about red blood cell count as a saving account, during the reproductive life of a female, in every cycle, which is about 28 days, we do have a few days that from this saving account, we withdraw some volume of blood. Clearly, the red bone marrow first has to try its best to deposit, to replace those erythrocytes that have been lost during the menstruation. So that's one reason for lower hematocrit level in female versus male. Another reason is that in male there is a strong stimulus for production of erythropoietin. That would be the hormone testosterone, which we know testosterone is released from some cells in testes. We call those cells Leydig cells. And the Leydig cells, when male reaches puberty, increase the amount of testosterone that they release. Testosterone stimulates the cells in kidneys, and as a result, those cells increase secretion of erythropoietin. And we know when the erythropoietin level increases, we end up with more reticulocytes and therefore more erythrocytes. So that's something to consider, that a steroid hormone such as testosterone can increase the erythropoietin level. One interesting fact about these kidney cells that release erythropoietin is their unique reaction to experiencing hypoxia. When we say hypoxia, that simply means the level of oxygen in blood that supplies a tissue is lower than what it's supposed to be. So when we measure the pressure of oxygen in blood, it's low. Most cells in our body, if they do not receive enough oxygen, what they do, they slow down their activity in order to survive. However, the kidney cells that produce erythropoietin do to some extent the opposite. If they do not receive enough oxygen, they increase secretion of erythropoietin, which the result would be increasing the number of erythrocytes. So that would be the way that kidneys participate in solving the problem of hypoxia. Since tissues are not receiving enough oxygen, by increasing the number of erythrocytes, the body is trying through this negative feedback system to basically deliver enough oxygen to the tissue cells. So in any situation that we expose our kidneys to hypoxia, we expect more release of erythropoietin. A few examples of when our kidneys experience hypoxia would be, for example, in those patients that they have anemia. Recall that there are multiple causes for anemia. It could be due to not having enough iron, or lack of certain amino acids, or lack of vitamin B12, or in some blood disorders. But one thing that they all have in common is that tissues, including the tissues that we have in kidneys, experience hypoxia, and the reaction that kidneys have would be elevating the level of erythropoietin secretion. Please note that in those individuals that they have some kidney disorders and not enough erythropoietin hormone is released, one of the complications of their problems would be anemia. It simply means that by not receiving enough erythropoietin, red bone marrow is not stimulated to produce enough red blood cells. So the hematocrit level would be less than what it's supposed to be, and anemia is one of the signs of these kidney disorders. So that shows the importance of having healthy kidneys in order to keep the level of our red blood cell count within the acceptable range. Another example why we experience hypoxia would be circulatory problems in some individuals that reduce blood flow to the tissues. For example, if plaque forms and narrow down the lumen of the blood vessel, obviously the blood vessel that supplies the tissue is going to flow less blood toward the tissue, so hypoxia would be expected. Also, changing the altitude impacts how much we receive oxygen. As we know, when we go to high altitude, naturally there is low oxygen in air, which simply that means that we end up with less oxygen in our blood, and our tissues are going to experience hypoxia. And let's note that tissues in kidneys are also exposed to hypoxia. What they do, they react to being exposed to hypoxia by releasing more erythropoietin hormone into the bloodstream. Basically, this is the effort of kidneys to eventually increase the number of red blood cells, so these red blood cells can transport more oxygen to the tissues. This explains why some professional athletes use natural blood doping as a technique to physically be prepared for the competition that they're going to have. Natural blood doping refers to a strategy of having their training camp in high altitude, and it has been shown that it greatly impacts their physical fitness, endurance, and performance. Basically, what happens is when you are in high altitude, as I just explained, you are expose your body to lower oxygen level, so you end up with more secretion of erythropoietin, and you're going to increase your hematocrit level, the percentage of your blood that is occupied by red blood cells. And also doing vigorous exercise, as we know, definitely is another factor that exposes us to hypoxia. Just think about it. The moment that you start exercising, especially those exercises that we refer to them as cardio or aerobic, your breathing changes simply because when you're physically very active doing some vigorous exercises, the amount of oxygen that you have in your blood is not sufficient for the physical activity, and also your body is producing more waste, more carbon dioxide. So the waste has to be eliminated from your body. That's the moment that the respiratory center of brain fires signals and changes breathing from a normal quiet breathing into a forceful labored breathing. So being trained in high altitude brings several advantages for this athlete, And clearly adding to the number of red blood cells make it possible for the body of these athletes during competition to transport more oxygen to the tissues and remove more waste from the tissues. However, it is important to note that even though this sounds a great idea, but we have to acknowledge the fact that there is a limit for how much we can make physiological changes in our body without being at risk of negative consequences. What does it mean? When we keep adding to our red blood cell count, and basically we're increasing our hematocrit level, our blood becomes thicker. And we know that a thicker blood is not going to flow easily through the blood vessels. So the moment that blood viscosity increases, we're demanding that the pump of cardiovascular system work harder to push such a thick blood through our blood vessels. So that's one thing that happens. And the question is the heart ready for this extra overload? Have we built enough physiological cardiomegaly to expect such a thing from our heart? And the next thing that we need to pay attention is that when blood is more viscous, a thicker blood has more friction with the wall of blood vessels. In a very simple term, we refer to the friction that blood has with the wall of blood vessels as resistance. So what we are saying here is that a higher viscosity of blood results in having more resistance to blood flow. And that explains why blood pressure increases. That explains why heart has to pump blood more forcefully through our blood vessels. Let me just use another example. Imagine your hematocrit level is really high, your blood is more viscous, and you are at rest. You're laying down in bed completely relaxed. Is your heart really at a resting situation? The answer is no. In general, even in that resting position that you are, your heart still has to pump blood more forcefully. And obviously we cannot expect an organ such as heart to constantly be in an emergency situation and work more than what it's supposed to, because the consequences of increasing the hematocrit level to a dangerous level would be, first of all, cardiac arrest is possible. Also, we know that a much thicker blood leads to some problems such as formation of unwanted blood clot. And another problem that could arise from this would be, for example, heart attack, stroke, and such. So the point that we are making here is, in general, there is a limit for how much we should add to our hematocrit level, simply because when we make a change in one part of our body, that change impacts many other structures that we have in our body. And we are designed to handle gradual changes and not extreme and fast changes much better. I hope that you find this information about erythropoietin hormone helpful.